Hello friends, Chance here and welcome to Chance Code. In this video, we are going to explore an exception instead of an API. And the exception for today's topic is SuperNotCalledException. If you are an Android developer, then you might probably have seen this, or at least you might have known about it. So it is thrown by Android framework when you try to override a lifecycle method like onCreate and onResume of an activity or some lifecycle method of fragment, and you forget to call the superclass method, then you are going to get this exception. So let's see one of the example like this. So here is my main activity where I have overridden onCreate lifecycle method, and as you can see I have called super.onCreate in the first line, and then I have written my follow-up lines of code. For some instance, let's try to comment this out. Or just imagine that you have forgot to call the super.onCreate of saved instance state. So in that case, you might get SuperNotCalledException. So in this video, we are going to explore how SuperNotCalledException is implemented by Android framework and how they are tracking whether we are calling the superclass corresponding methods or not. We will create a similar kind of functionality to clone this and try to understand this. Now let's see that in action. So what I'll do is I'll try to comment this out and run this to see what is the behavior. So it's running now. I'll open the logcat, and if you see here activity, SuperNotCalledException activity did not call through super.onCreate. So basically we have to call this, otherwise it will fail. Let's now go ahead and try to understand how Android tracks whether we have called this super.onCreate or not by creating a sample project. So let's jump to our IntelliJ IDEA instead of Android Studio. As you can see, I have already created a package. So now let's go ahead and create a class. So I'll name it as a SuperNotCalledException, and I'll extend it to runtime exception. Now let's go ahead and try to implement. So a SuperNotCalledException, I'll make it as a public constructor and accept a message. And for the simpler implementation, I'll just call the superclass constructor. So I'm done with the SuperNotCalledException implementation. Let's create a test class now and do the main method. So from here we will start doing the actual stuff. So now let's create an activity class. So for that, let's say activity, and what I'll do here is I'll create a onCreate method. So onCreate. For the sake of simple implementation, I'm not having any argument here, but in Android there are a lot of onCreate overloaded methods with different types of arguments. So this is your framework side, or maybe you can say it as a library side of your code. Now let's go ahead and create the client side of this code by extending this activity. So I'll create another class called test activity, and I'll try to extend the activity. So I'm done with it. If onCreate is being implemented by here, as of now, the application will work even without this. Now to mandate this to be called by the client or by the user of your library, you have to do something for this. Now let's go ahead and look into it. Let's comment it out and try to use this test activity. So what I'll do is I'll go to the test class and I'll create a test activity object. Now let's run this and see what happens. So as you can see, nothing happened and it ran successfully. Now if you want the test activity should throw an SuperNotCalledException if we are not calling this, so we have to do something for it. So let's jump into the library class and see how we can do it. So for the sake of that, I'll create a variable called equal to false. And whenever onCreate is called, what I'll do, I'll assign it as a true by saying that onCreate is being called. So we moved one step forward. Now let's move to the next step. And for this step, let's go ahead and create another class for our library section called instrumentation. And this is a class which is responsible to call the activities lifecycle methods in Android framework. We are not going to do or implement the exact same way how Android has implemented because it is going to be very complex. So we are going to have a minimal approach how this works. So I'll create a public method here saying call activity on create and accept an activity instance here. So this is the class in instrumentation which is responsible for calling the lifecycle method called onCreate of any corresponding activity of Android classes. Now what I'll do here, I'll call the activity classes a method called perform create. So this method is not there. Let's go ahead and create this. So I'll create a package private method called perform create. Now if you see instrumentation, it is just fine. Let's go to the perform create and start implementing this. But before implementing this, let's create another internal API called attach, which accepts something called as instrumentation. Now what we'll do, we'll try to capture this instrumentation. So let's go ahead and create a variable called private instrumentation instrumentation. So what I'll do here, I'll assign that as instrumentation. Now here what I'll do instrumentation dot call on activity create and I'll pass this. And now if you'll go inside here, you can see activity dot perform create is being called, which is like kind of a like calling the same method again and again. So instead of perform create, we have to call on create. So now if you go here, on create is being called, but how to throw that exception, which is the main agenda of this video. So what I'll do here is mCalled equal to false. This makes mCalled is false. Now if it goes and calls this on create, then it makes on mCalled equal to true. So here I can check if mCalled is false, that means this on create is not yet called. So here we can throw the exception, throw SuperNotCalled exception by passing a message saying call super dot on create. So the way it works is, first somebody will call perform create, and from perform create it will make the mCalled flag as false, and then it will call activity on create, and from call activity on create it will again call activities on create method. And if your client is overridden by this method, then they have to call the superclass method to make it true. If they are not calling it, then this will be still false, and in this case this will become true and this will be throwing an exception. So let's go ahead and try to do something like testing instrumentation equal new instrumentation activity dot attach instrumentation activity dot perform create. So as you can see, these 4 statements I have written just to show you how this works, but actually this is not the way Android framework creates an activity or Android framework creates an instrumentation. Instead of this way, Android follows a lot of different paths to create the activity and instrumentation classes and to do the perform create operation. So let's go ahead and try to run this. So as you can see, I got the SuperNotCalled exception here. Now what I'll do, I'll go to test activity and uncomment this, and I can go back and run this. So as you can see, it ran fine without throwing any exception. If you are planning for creating a library which has some classes like activity, and you want the client who uses your library to call some particular method of your library so that you can initialize your library or do some internal process before the client go ahead and use it, this is the way you can do it in a better way. So as we have done with the implementation, now let's go and see how Android has implemented this and try to understand how much it differs from our implementation. And for that, let's jump into the Android Studio. As we can see, we are in activity thread. Let's search something called perform launch activity. So if you'll see, you can imagine this as the main method of our implementation. So this main method is equivalent to perform launch activity. Now let's go ahead and see, activity is null and it is trying to create an activity in this place. So obviously there are a lot of different activities it has to do to form an activity class, which we haven't covered in this thing because it is out of the scope of our video. Now let's go beyond and see what it does with this. It calls activity.attach. And if you see, it passes instrumentation. Along with instrumentation, it passes all other things, but we are not concerned about that. Now let's go below and see, it says activity.mCalled equal to false. Then it calls something called as call activity on create. We have done something similar to that. Once the attach is done, we have called perform create, and we have done the activity mCalled equal to false. Then we have tried to call this way, and from here it calls the on create. If you go here, you will see it calls perform create. Now let's go to perform create and see how it does. And if you go to perform create, it calls the on create. Now let's go back and see, it does the almost similar thing by calling SuperNotCalledException by checking this one. So we have done the similar stuff here. Now let's see how it does with on start, some other method. If you'll go beyond this, if you'll see here, it creates an activity, then it calls perform start. Let's go to activity class and search that perform start. If you can see, it calls mCalled equal to false. Then it calls on start, and from on start it calls on start of this one, and it makes the mCalled equal to true, which is the same thing we have done in our case by making mCalled equal to true here. Now if you'll go here, if on start is called, that means super class is called, then mCalled will be true here, so it will not execute this. Otherwise it will be executed and it will throw the exception. Hope you understand how SuperNotCalled exception is thrown by Android framework, how Android is tracking whether we have called the superclass corresponding methods or not. Now if you liked this video, if you understand some new thing from this video, please do like, share and subscribe to our channel. Thank you. Thanks a lot for watching it.